The Byte Show is listener supported at thebyteshow.com.
Hello, everybody. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes, and this is The Byte Show. And it is a real blessing to have Joseph P. Farrell with us tonight. And I'm asking people to please go to GizaDeathStar.com. That's Joseph's private site. There is a PayPal button there. Please make use of it. We want to keep Joseph writing, and this move that he's just recently undergone for the purposes of his life it's been expensive, and he does need some help. So please go to GizaDeathStar.com and make use of the PayPal button. And tonight we're going to delve into the Philosopher's Stone. Hi, Joseph.
Hey, GeorgeAnn. Before you start, I wanted to say something about the donations.
Okay.
As you know, I've had to move, and just today got slammed with something else.
Oh dear.
But I wanted to send a word of deep gratitude and thanks to one listener in particular. I won't mention her name nor where she is, but you know who you are, and I received 2 flabbergasting donations from this dear lady today.
That's wonderful.
And I literally broke down and cried. And I want to thank you and ask God to bless you. Thank you so much, because it came right when everything else just got slammed. And I'm still not out of the woods, but I do appreciate all those who've helped with this, because it was as you know, as we've talked, it was kind of a touch and go situation, and it was a rough move, but I did want to say that word of thanks to those people and to that lady in particular. It's appreciated so much more than you know.
Well, that's very nice, Joseph. Okay. The Philosopher's Stone.
Uh-huh.
This is our first recording concerning that book.
Yes.
For those that might be listening but don't understand what alchemy is,
yes.
What is alchemy?
Well, alchemy is one of the branches of what we can call the esoteric arts, or if you prefer, the esoteric crafts. It is a very, very old craft. It dates back to, depending on who you study and who you consult, but it dates back to ancient Egypt and or ancient China. Oddly enough, both civilizations were deeply steeped in various alchemical traditions. It's interesting that if you go back to Egypt, the ancient Egyptian name for Egypt is Al-Chem, from which we get our word alchemy. So, in other words, there is a clear ancient provenance to this science, and I'm going to call it a science rather than a pseudoscience, as for reasons that will become clear as we proceed. But alchemy has as its goal, as its principal motivation, to take the materia prima, the prime matter, out of or down from heaven, so to speak,
yes,
and embody it in what's called the Philosopher's Stone, in a material, earthly form. Okay? And the goal of that operation, then, is to be able, in alchemical parlance, to transmute base metals such as tin or lead or nickel or something like that into gold. In other words, a literal transformation of one element into the other. Now that's the meaning of the Philosopher's Stone in its most basic prosaic sense, and that is the goal of alchemy in its most basic prosaic sense. But when you study alchemical texts, the thing that you'll immediately notice, and I'm sure that you have because I know that you've read a lot of them yourself,
Yes.
is that these texts are very, very carefully phrased so that they can bear a multitude of meanings. And, you know, we've discussed in the Cosmic War series my idea that many of these ancient texts are, in fact, deliberately constructed in this fashion so that several layers of meaning are all possible and plausible, and
Yes.
that these texts are deliberately meant to convey several meanings. So, if we go beyond the prosaic meaning of the Philosopher's Stone, let's look at what they're actually saying. And I get into this in the Philosopher's Stone, in the book by that name. The first two chapters are actually devoted to a discussion of this subject. If you look at the materia prima, the prime matter, the way that alchemy views it is, in fact, very, very contemporary. It is eerily similar to certain models of the physical medium that you would find within modern physics. Because the materia prima, the prime matter in alchemy, is a transmutating medium itself. This is why it's able to effect the transmutation of base metals into gold, because in alchemical thinking, all matter comes ultimately from this materia prima. Okay? In other words, it's the prime matter itself, which is the ultimate Philosopher's Stone. It is the matter before matter, so to speak. Okay? And in the process of diversifying itself, then all creation emerges. And of course, this is a very, very ancient Egyptian way of looking at the whole process of creation itself. Now, if we look at this prime matter from the point of view of a modern physicist, because it exists prior to any differentiation, that means it has absolutely no distinguishing features within it. Okay? It is a literal nothing. A literal physical nothing.
Okay.
Because there cannot be any observation of anything in it. All right? It's once distinction begins to emerge that you begin to have physical somethings. So in other words, alchemy in a certain sense even is talking about a creation ex nihilo, but it's not a nothing in terms of a void. It's a nothing that's a something, but the something doesn't have any distinguishing characteristics. That's a tongue twister, but
it's kind of confusing.
It's kind of confusing, but if you stop and think about it, it makes sense. It's a nothing that's a something without any distinguishing characteristics. Okay, it's not a zero. It's not a mere void. It's a different kind of nothingness. It's the kind of nothingness that you would think of in connection to Eastern religions like Mahayana Buddhism and certain features of Hinduism and so on and so forth. But anyway, it is a transmutating medium. In other words, the very idea of the materia prima in alchemy creates information in the field, and that is a very, very modern physics concept. In fact, the Russian physicists during the Soviet era were the first physicists to start thinking along these lines and writing openly about it. So it's a very, very modern idea. So alchemy in that sense, then, is dealing with a science, as it were, a craft, to manipulate the fabric of space-time, which is exactly what we've been talking about all along.
Yes.
all of these different interviews that we've been having over the past 3 years. Okay, so in other words, this is another aspect of this whole story. All right. Now let's look at a third layer of alchemy. There is a third meaning of the Philosopher's Stone and this idea of transmuting base metals into gold. Because in some alchemical texts, that idea of transmutation of base metals into gold is a metaphor for the transmutation or the elevation of the human being himself. The idea that the human consciousness is transmuted from a base condition represented by the base metals into an elevated or illuminated consciousness that is illuminated precisely by a deep connection to that material prime matter. All right? Mm-hmm. So in other words, in that sense, alchemy is a science or a craft of social engineering.
Oh,
okay?
Yes.
So now let's look carefully. This is a very, very important point. Let's look very carefully at what we have, what alchemy is actually saying, and has been saying, for almost 2 to 3 millennia. If you look at what it's saying, it's telling you two very important things. Number one, it is a science of the deep manipulation of the physical medium directly, all right? And because of that, then, it is also a manipulation of the actual physical material creation in which we live and move and have our being, to use the words of Paul, all right?
Yeah.
But it's also telling you a second thing. The second thing it's telling you is that it is a deep, deep science of the manipulation of human consciousness, of social engineering, of human society. And the connection is, it's telling you that both of these things are coming out of a particular physics, a particular view of the physical medium itself. In other words, it's telling you that the science of creation or tinkering with a civilization is coming out of one and the same science that is manipulating the physical medium itself. So in other words, we're back to that idea that I've been outlining in all of my books and in some of these discussions that you and I have had. We're back to that idea that in very, very ancient times there was a tremendously unified science. We've discussed how in Babylon's banksters, how there is a deep, deep unification between physics and finance.
Yes.
And the two types of physics and financial systems. Well, all I'm saying now is let's go deeper, and the idea of a financial system being either an open or a closed system reflects itself in the financial policies of a particular given state and how it organizes those policies. Does it create money debt-free as a direct instrument of the state, or does it turn to a financial monopoly, a private monopoly, to issue monetized debt, okay, which is a closed system? All right? What I'm now proposing is that we're going deeper and saying that the financial aspect of it is but one aspect of a much deeper science of social engineering, of if you will, a magical working that influences the way that societies are organized and how they think. All right?
Okay.
And in that respect, then, alchemy is the key, because it's telling you, once again, that there's a deep connection between a consciousness, a cultural consciousness, an ethos of a given culture or civilization, and the type of physics that it adopts. It's telling you that you can have an open system physics where you have a transmutative medium that can literally create information, that you have a physics that is capable of the direct manipulation of that medium on the one hand, and it's telling you on the other that the same techniques, the same science can be used to transmute humanity itself, to transmute the consciousness, to engineer the human being. Now, this is a crucially, vitally important point, because I believe it was sometime around the middle of our Cosmic War series I mentioned that there is a deep, deep connection between this type of physics of the medium and consciousness itself. And that's precisely what alchemy is telling you. Because in text after text after text, it will tell you that you cannot undertake the work, the philosophical work, which means to make the philosopher's stone into actual material embodiment. You cannot undertake that work without the alchemist himself, without the operator himself undergoing his own transmutation. In other words, his own consciousness has a role in the preparation of the philosopher's stone. Is this all making sense?
Yes.
Okay. I'm glad. You sprang that on me out of nowhere.
Oh. Well, the comparison between modern physics and medieval esotericism, what is that?
Well, I've just given you that. Most of the medieval alchemical texts that I cite in the Philosopher's Stone are of such a nature that if you sit down and do with those texts essentially what I've been doing all along with any text of that sort, if you look at certain phrases in those texts very carefully and use modern physics models as a means of decoding them, what leaps out of these texts is that these guys were not so much idiots, tinkering around with sulfur and mercury and not really knowing what they were doing and, getting sick and dying insanely young and youngly insane. But that they were, in fact, probably not knowing completely, certainly not knowing completely what they were doing. Their texts were actually preserving a very sophisticated physics from very, very, very ancient times.
Well, now the physics that they used, are they the physics that we would use today, or was it a different type of physics? Well,
again, that's a good question, and I go back to what I've been saying all along. It depends on what you mean by the phrase, the physics we use today, because there is a public, so to speak, a public consumption physics that is reliant upon what physicists call the standard model, which is the relativistic theories of Einstein for the physics of the very large, and then the standard model of quantum mechanics for the physics of the very small. Okay? Now, that physics, in a certain sense, has been the physics that has dominated that particular science for, I'd say, the last 80 years, and it has dead-ended. In other words, it's a physics that's not going much of anywhere in that time. It hasn't really led to much of a solution to our energy problems or things of this sort. Follow me?
Yes.
There is another physics, an alternative physics, a physics that's not so much off the books, it's just not known, and it's not taught.
Yes.
And that physics has been around at least since Maxwell. And if we go back all the way to the first of the Cosmic War series, I mentioned that when Maxwell published his theory on electromagnetism, he did so in a mathematical language called quaternions. Now, in that form of his equations, Maxwell was trying to explain the idea of physical stress, electromagnetic stress, in the physical medium itself, all right?
Okay.
Now, along came a physicist later in the 19th century, and he essentially edited Maxwell's equations, and in his own words, his intention in doing so was to murder, that was his word, was to murder this idea of a stress in the physical medium itself. Okay? So he re-edited all of Maxwell's equations, and when you learn modern physics, modern electrodynamics in universities, the version of Maxwell's equations that you learn aren't Maxwell's original equations.
Yeah.
They are these edited versions that were given out by the physicist Oliver Heaviside, all right?
Yeah.
Now, what that essentially does is it means that there is no direct engineering possible via electromagnetic means. of the physical vacuum. In other words, he's just closed off a tremendous source of energy.
Yes.
By the caprice of a change in the mathematical language used to express the theory. All right? Yeah, so in other words, we're dealing with a long history here of suppression of certain ideas in physics that will lead you to these kinds of, if I can qualify them this way, to these kinds of alchemical results. Follow me?
Yeah.
So you are dealing literally with something that is a kind of physics that's been kept carefully hidden from public view. All right? And that carefully hidden physics from public view, that was a tradition that has continued all throughout the last 150 years of physics, if you know where to look and what papers to read. Okay? So, you know, there is this stuff out there in the physics literature, but you'll never hear it talked about, I guarantee you, in a physics textbook or a university physics classroom. You'll never hear it, ever, because it leads to a completely different kind of physics. Does that kind of answer your question adequately?
Yes. And what is the doctrine of double procession?
Procession? All right. In the Philosopher's Stone, one of the things I point out is that if you take the Western formulation, the Western Christian formulation of the doctrine of the Trinity, and when I say that, people have to understand that the doctrine of the Trinity, as formulated by the Roman Catholic Church, by all the Protestant churches, is the same thing, all right? But it is not the way that the doctrine was originally formulated by the Church Fathers in the East. So in other words, the Eastern churches, the Eastern Orthodox Church, has a different doctrine of the Trinity. All right? Mm-hmm. In the Western doctrine, the Holy Spirit is made to take his personal origin in eternity from the Father and the Son. All right? Mm-hmm. In the Eastern doctrine, the Holy Spirit is made to take his personal origin from the Father alone. All right?
Okay.
Okay. Now, the reason I pointed out the Western doctrine in the Philosopher's Stone is that if you look carefully at the way the doctrine is formulated, it comes straight, absolutely straight out of Hermetic and alchemical texts that pre-existed the Christian religion.
Oh.
And in that context, then, if you look at the doctrine the way a mathematician or a topologist would look at that doctrine, what you end up with is that the doctrine is simply, as a doctrine, not needed, because what you're dealing with in those texts is precisely a mathematical metaphor, so to speak.
Okay.
And you're dealing, in other words, with something that's really about the physical medium and not about the doctrine of God at all. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in the Hermetic texts become God, space, and cosmos. And I take you through all the different texts to show the correlations and so on and so forth. But in alchemical doctrine, then, the double procession means that the Philosopher's Stone, if you're confecting an actual Philosopher's Stone to transmute base metals into gold, that stone is coming from two sources. The first source is going to be the materia prima itself,
yes,
the prime matter, and then the second source is it's just going to be everyday, ordinary matter. And by doing certain alchemical operations, certain procedures to everyday ordinary matter, then you embody the properties or the functions of the Philosopher's Stone in that ordinary matter. That's what's going on.
Oh.
Yeah. Oh. Now, this is an important point that you raised, because with the resemblance between the formulation of the doctrine of the Trinity in the Western churches to alchemical text, all right?
Yes.
With the similarity, it is no wonder then that alchemy survives precisely in the Christian West, because it was very easy for alchemists in the West in the Middle Ages to cloak their texts behind a veneer of Christian language.
Oh, my goodness.
See what's going on?
Yeah.
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 The plot thickened.
Yes, it did.
Yes, it did.
Well, when they undertake these operations,
yes.
There's certain astronomical alignments and things that they pay very close attention to.
Yes.
Why is that?
Because this is an excellent point. Because if you go back to what I've been saying, and we even broached the subject in the 2 interviews about Babylon's banksters, this whole physics is a physics of the medium, right?
Yes.
Therefore, planetary positions affect the physical medium and its operations. Follow me?
Yes.
So in other words, alchemists will tell you that you will not get the same results if you perform the same experiment, but perform it at different times. In other words, when the planets are in different positions.
Oh.
Okay?
Okay.
Now go all the way back to something I said in the very, very first parts of the Cosmic War. I mentioned the fact that when the United States fired off its first hydrogen bomb, we had calculated a yield for that device to be between 4 to 6 megatons.
Yes.
When we fired the thing off, it ran away to a yield of about 10 megatons.
Yes.
In other words, more than double the low end of the calculated yield. Now that's quite a whopping miscalculation,
yes.
especially if you're going to be clearing an area. You know, you folks got to get out of here because we're going to fire off a hydrogen bomb.
Yeah.
You know, well, if you've miscalculated the yield and it's a much bigger bomb than you were expecting, you know, you're going to have a lot of angry real estate brokers. You know?
Oh.
But the point is here, as I mentioned in that, I think it was the 2nd or 3rd Cosmic War installment, the point is that it's my belief that the reason that they got this anomalous yield was that they soon discovered that the yield of these devices would vary with time and where on the surface of the Earth they were detonated. Because at the moment of detonation, what that bomb is doing is it's gating energy. It's transducing the energy of the vacuum into the reaction itself. And that gating of energy is going to depend on the position of the planets. In other words, the energy configuration of local celestial space. And that, of course, varies over time.
Yes.
So in other words, I think one of the reasons that the nuclear powers, when they fired off their hydrogen bombs, that one of the reasons they kept testing them was they were realizing that, hey, we're getting energy here that we had not calculated for, and it's coming from somewhere, and we've got to find out where and how. And I think that the reason they kept firing them off was they were trying to learn these harmonic laws, okay?
Yes.
Well, alchemy said the same thing centuries before, that you could only perform this work and get decent results when certain astronomical alignments were in place, all right?
Okay.
Now, lo and behold, and I mentioned there's a whole section of this devoted to this topic in the Philosopher's Stone, to the work of a Russian astrophysicist by the name of Dr. Nikolai Kozyrev, all right? Now, I strongly suspect that the reason that Kozyrev's work went deeply black in the Soviet Union was that Kozyrev, being an astrophysicist, had said almost the same thing that I just said concerning hydrogen bombs. He noticed that the sun was not producing nearly enough neutrinos as the standard thermonuclear model of the sun being nothing but a big chained-up hydrogen bomb predicted. And it was therefore transducing energy from some other source, okay?
Yeah.
And if that's the case, the Soviets lit off their hydrogen bomb and probably found the same thing, all right, that we did. They had calculated a yield and got a lot more bang out of it than they were expecting, all right? But they had one advantage we didn't. They had an astrophysicist who had said already the same thing about the sun. And he suspected and he came right out and said it in his papers at the time, that he suspected that the reason the sun was gating energy had something to do with time.
Oh.
And of course, the only way in physics that you measure time is what? By the changes of planetary bodies.
Yes.
Okay? So in other words, he was saying essentially the same thing that the alchemists had been saying all along. You see?
Oh my goodness.
So his work went deeply black. We didn't even find out that Kozyrev was doing all of these time experiments. And in performing certain experiments, he did numerous different types of things. But one of the things he noticed was that he would get very fine variations of experimental results performing the same experiment, but doing so at different times.
He also said that time is a creature.
Well, he said that time is not a scalar, I think is what he said. He did not say time is not a creature. He said time is not a scalar, and that's quite a bit different. But the point is that his experiments demonstrated that experimental results vary with time. They vary with planetary positions. They vary with the phases of the moon. And if you didn't see the equations that he accompanies his little papers with, you would swear you're reading a medieval alchemist.
Oh.
Because they're saying exactly the same thing. So in other words, once again, if you take modern physics models, little-known modern physics models and experiments and people doing these things, and then go back and look at some of these ancient or esoteric or medieval texts, you're going to discover amazing parallels. So once again, the case is made that these fraternities, these societies, these esoteric crafts and arts are preserving some kernel of a real science that existed at some point a long, long, long time ago.
Oh, my goodness. What about the Habsburgs, Emperor Ferdinand and Leopold I?
Well, this is the other part of the story. And to give kind of paint a bit of a context for why I decided to pursue inquiries into alchemy. At the end of the Giza Death Star destroyed, or I should say probably more toward the middle of it, I pointed out that there is really what I call the esoteric gap, all right? Mm-hmm. There is a period of time from the death of the last great Neoplatonic magician, and we've discussed this before very early on in the Cosmic War series, the death of the last great Neoplatonic magician by the name of Iamblichus, circa 430 to 450 AD, and the rise of the first palpable modern esoteric occult secret society in the form of the Knights Templar, much later, 8 centuries later, in 13th century France. Okay? So you have a gap there of approximately 800 years.
Yeah.
But when esotericism reemerges onto the scene in Europe, it reemerges fully fledged. In other words, there's no gradual development or build-up. It's just all of a sudden there again. All right? So in other words, I come to the conclusion that the only rational way to explain this is esotericism went deeply underground, but continued in more or less a continuous stream between those two poles, between that gap of 800 years. And the mechanism by which it did so, and this is why alchemy is so important, the mechanism by which it did so was through alchemy. And the reason why was, again, because the alchemists could disguise their beliefs and their teachings and their doctrines under the veneer of the way that the Western Church had formulated its doctrine of the Trinity.
Oh.
You see?
Oh my.
Yeah, it's a very, very, it's, I don't want to say it's diabolical or sinister, but it is at least Byzantine and subtle.
Yes. Oh my. Well, what about the alchemical reading of the golden calf in the Old Testament?
Oh boy. That's a biggie, and I get into that. The first book I discuss that in is The Giza Death Star Destroyed. Now, to set this up, I have to point out that when you read alchemical literature, when they're talking about the philosopher's stone, the stone that transmutes base metals into gold, they understand it at the most prosaic level as existing in basically two different forms, and listen carefully. The first form is as a tincture, in other words, a liquid, all right? And when they discuss it in those terms, they usually ascribe to the philosopher's stone amazing powers of healing and even of longevity, all right? The second way that the philosopher's stone is described is as a very pure, very fine white powder. Okay? With me?
Yes.
Now, there is a whole section in the book called The Philosopher's Stone where I discuss the powder form and its modern discovery. And I'll repeat what I just said to let it sink in on people. There's a whole section in The Philosopher's Stone where I discuss the modern discovery of this fine white powder. Because there is a gentleman by the name of David Hudson who discovered this, largely through accident, that when he took metals in the platinum group, all right, in other words, iridium, rhodium, platinum, and so on, and subjected them to extremely high temperature.
Okay.
So that the metal was not only burned, it not only melted, but it was actually burned and consumed to the point that the metal was reduced to an extremely fine, guess what, white powder.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, when he did that, an amazing thing happened. He discovered when he put this powdered iridium, platinum, rhodium, and even in some cases gold on a finely balanced scale balance to weigh it, he discovered that even though it had the same chemical property as the original element, it had lost approximately 44% of the mass.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, oh, my goodness.
Oh.
All right. Now, on top of that, so did the scale. In other words, the scale lost 44% of the mass just by coming into contact with this stuff.
Oh, my
all right?
gosh.
All right? With me so far?
Yes.
So he started investigating, well, you know, what's all this about? And he contacted the theoretical physicist Hal Puthoff down at the Institute for Advanced Physics down in Austin, Texas.
Yes.
And the reason he contacted him was that Hal Puthoff had written a paper, and I reproduced this in The Philosopher's Stone, had written a paper where he proves, you know, it's a very highly mathematical paper. You've got to sit down and kind of be patient with it. But basically, he proves that if you take a two-dimensional superconductor of matter and put it into a two-dimensional form, it basically will lose 44% of its mass. So, you know, Hudson contacted Puthoff, and Puthoff was just dumbfounded that someone had actually come up with a material that did precisely what his paper described, you know. And now, in addition to this, there's another aspect of this fine white powder gold, or it's called monatomic gold in most literature concerning it, because Hudson discovered that this powder really had reduced the molecular bonding of these metals to a single atom. So in other words, what you're looking at with this fine white powder are just tiny little atoms, not connected to any other atom. They're just all on their own.
And an Arizona farmer.
Yes, ma'am. I kid you. An Arizona farmer did this, and we can get into the long process of how he discovered all this later, but I'm trying to get to your question about the golden calf.
Yeah.
All right?
Okay.
So the other thing that Hudson noticed was when he started reading alchemical texts, he discovered that this is precisely the state or condition that those alchemical masters stated was what you would achieve when you had finally confected the Philosopher's Stone. In other words, they said that at the final stage of all these alchemical processes, including subjection of these things to extreme heat, all right? In other words, gold, to burn gold, not to melt it, but to burn gold requires heat of approximately 8,000 degrees Fahrenheit.
Whoa.
To actually physically consume it. He discovered that alchemical texts refer to the Philosopher's Stone, to the final stage of its construction, of its confection, as being a fine white powder. So again, we have yet another modern confirmation that what these people were talking about wasn't so nutty after all.
Well, didn't he also discover something about DNA?
Well, we can get to that.
Okay.
We've got all the time in the world to get to all these places.
Okay.
Just let me stay on track with the Old Testament here for a moment.
Okay.
If you go back now and read the episode of the Golden Calf, what does Moses do? Well, he melts it down, doesn't he?
Yes.
But then he feeds it to them. And how do you feed gold to somebody? Well, if you read the text very carefully, he melts it down to what? A powder.
Yes.
In other words, you're reading in the Old Testament, squatting right in the middle of the Bible. You're reading about an alchemical operation, and then he makes them eat it.
Oh, my.
Now, recall the other thing I said about what the alchemists claim for the Philosopher's Stone. It is a stone that has healing properties and that can confer longevity.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes. So in other words, the whole story in the Old Testament is alchemical from top to bottom.
Oh.
Now, this really shouldn't surprise us, because where did Moses grow up? Egypt.
Yes.
And where is alchemy from? Egypt.
Oh, my goodness.
You see?
Oh.
Now, the other thing I point out in the Giza Death Star Destroyed, when I discuss this episode, and I discuss it again in the Philosopher's Stone, but in the Giza Death Star Destroyed, I point out that one of the places that Moses apparently had the Hebrews, quote-unquote, wander to was precisely the location of an Egyptian temple in the Sinai that was used to make this white powder gold.
Oh, my
goodness. This monatomic gold. And the Egyptians even had a name for it, and I can't even pronounce it. You know? But in other words, this really, again, is the indicator that we have in the biblical text a carefully edited story that has a deeper significance that you will only understand if you know certain things about the esoteric arts and crafts.
Yes.
All right. Now, what was your other question? DNA.
Yes.
All right. Hudson discovered that when he took this stuff, when he actually consumed it, that it did a very peculiar thing. It made his thoughts very clear and gave him a sense of peace and euphoria, and for some reason it revitalized him. And again, he started reading in the alchemical text and discovered that you know, this Philosopher's Stone, whatever the alchemists were using to confect it, was described as conferring the same properties. Well, there have been studies since then with this monatomic element type material that these little atoms latch themselves on to the strands of DNA and sort of clean them up. In other words, they clean up the ability of those strands of DNA to pass electrical currents through them with lower resistance. So in other words, your body, in a certain sense, becomes more unified because the cells are communicating with each other electrically much more quickly and much more efficiently.
The synapses would
The synapses
more
too.
efficient, yes.
Yeah, the synapses too. Right, right. And I have to say that I have myself taken some of this monatomic gold, and the effect is exactly what Hudson describes. You get a very, very relaxing, peaceful feeling, and your thoughts are very, very clear. Very clear.
I need some of that. Oh my goodness. Well, going back in time, Nicholas Flamel.
Yes.
It was said that when Napoleon sacked Rome,
yes,
that he gave Nicholas Flamel free rein to sack the libraries.
But the problem here is Nicholas Flamel wasn't alive when Napoleon was.
Well, the author made a mistake.
The author made a boo-boo.
Yeah. But when Nicholas Flamel died, it is said that later his grave was
yes, that's true.
exhumed, and there was no body there.
That I've heard that story, and I've heard the version where his body had not even shown any signs of decay.
Yeah.
Now that is another odd thing, because there are consistent stories of that nature within the alchemical tradition. And again, you've got the whole legend of the Vicomte de Saint-Germain, who was reportedly an alchemist and who lived a long time. But those stories are persistent within the alchemical literature. I review many of them in the first part of The Philosopher's Stone, as a matter of fact. Flamel is interesting because
yes,
I reproduce several stories in The Philosopher's Stone where apparently there was some sort of success by various alchemists in Europe, beginning right around the time of the Renaissance and continuing all the way up to Flamel's period. There was apparently some success because they had a number of alchemists brought before the king or the emperor to perform the work, and every precaution against fraud was taken. And in the case of the Habsburgs, you mentioned them earlier, Ferdinand,
yes,
and I think it was Leopold II, and so on and so forth. Well, the Habsburg family has had a consistent interest in alchemy. And in a couple of cases, at least the way the official history reads, the alchemist was successful in confecting the Philosopher's Stone, was able to transmute base metals into gold, and the emperor had coins cast from that gold in commemoration of the event.
Oh.
So in other words, with someone like the Habsburgs, you're going to be dealing with people that are going to take every precaution against fraud.
Yes.
And, we have to assume that, contrary to the dictates of modern scientists, or scientismists, I should say, who cast the acid of skepticism on any story like that, we have to assume, given all that we know now from the theoretical physicist Hal Puthoff and the patents of David Hudson and so on and so forth, that there is more to this science, this ancient science, than meets the eye.
Yes. Yes. Well, the Philosopher's Stone occupies no space.
Yes, that's one of the. Yes, I'm glad you raised that. One of the claims made for the Philosopher's Stone is that it occupies no space. Well, in this instance, they are referring to the materia prima, because if you're dealing with something that's a nothing, in other words, it's something but it has no distinctions whatsoever within it, then you cannot say that it's occupying any space, because that already gives you a distinction. Okay. So, in a certain sense, they're talking about the materia prima, but in the prosaic sense, if you look at it from the standpoint of modern physics, they're saying that it doesn't occupy this 3D space, all right?
Yes.
Now, let's go back to Hal Puthoff for a moment. If you sit down and read his paper about two-dimensional superconductors, what he's really saying is the missing mass of these superconductors is actually present in a different dimensional space.
Oh.
In other words, a higher dimensional space.
Yes.
It's literally a kind of matter that exists partly here in this three-dimensional world and partly in a 4D, 5D, 3 plus n dimensional world, all right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of a bridge between different types of worlds. So in other words, the mass isn't really missing, it's just gone elsewhere.
Oh my goodness. Oh.
Yeah, oh my goodness.
And it cured at a distance.
Yes, this is another claim made for the Philosopher's Stone. It was able to cure at a distance. It was able to confer longevity. And one of my favorites, GeorgeAnn, is in some alchemical texts, the Philosopher's Stone is referred to as the indestructible stone.
Oh.
In other words, once it's made, you can't get rid of it.
Oh, dear. You better want to know what you're doing.
You better want to know what you're doing. Right.
Oh.
Exactly. Well, the reason is again, if you can find some technique by which to embody within ordinary matter the properties of the materia prima into ordinary matter, that materia prima from which all other matter derives, according to alchemical doctrine, is precisely indestructible.
Wow.
Wow. Yeah.
Oh.
Now, let's go back. Remember in the Cosmic War when we were discussing the Tablets of Destinies?
Yes.
And how there were 3 classes that were taken by the victors in that war?
Yeah.
And some of them were used in other things?
Yes.
And some of them were destroyed, but there was a 3rd class of those Tablets of Destinies. There were stones, please note, that could not be destroyed.
Oh.
So in other words, I think, again, we're looking at a very, very old science of some sort that has been preserved in these alchemical texts, and the possibility in my mind is quite high that when we're looking at that particular Babylonian story, that we're looking again at some aspect of what later becomes alchemy.
Boy.
Yeah, boy.
Well, is there any relationship to the Urim and Thummim?
No, I don't think so, not directly. But again, I do think that, and I get into this a bit in Gene Stein's Monsters Men, the book that's at the printer now. I do think there's a relationship, there's some sort of technological aspect to the Urim and Thummim.
Okay.
But I don't view it as being directly connected to alchemy, no.
Okay. What about red mercury? Is that real or fake or what?
Oh boy, yeah.
And how do the Russians fit?
You want to open all the boxes tonight.
Yes.
You want to tear into all the presents.
How do the Russians fit into
this? Okay. Red mercury was the nuclear scare of the 1990s.
Yeah.
It was a reportedly, it was a cherry red substance, a liquid goo of very great density and weight.
Yeah.
That reportedly was capable of detonating a hydrogen bomb, all right? Because it was a very, very powerful explosive. Now, the reason this is significant, the reason that this story became so hot in the early 1990s, right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, was if you say that you have an explosive that is powerful enough to set off a hydrogen bomb, then you don't need an atom bomb as the fuse anymore.
Aha.
Because, you see, most people don't realize that in order to light off a hydrogen bomb, you quite literally have to have an atom bomb as the fuse. Okay? Because the hydrogen bomb reaction, the fusion reaction, requires tremendous heat and tremendous pressures to set it off. And under ordinary circumstances, that can only be achieved in the core of an atom bomb. All right? So in other words, a hydrogen bomb is really 2 bombs. It's the atom bomb that sets it off, and then it's the hydrogen bomb reaction itself that gives you the really big bang. All right?
Yeah.
So when you're saying that you have an explosive that can set off a hydrogen bomb, what you're really saying is you don't even need A-bombs anymore to light one off. You can have a really, really clean explosion because a hydrogen bomb itself does not give you the radioactive fallout that an atomic bomb does.
Yes.
Okay, it'll give you lots of radiation, but once that radiation is dissipated, you don't have any nasty fallout hanging around. You've just got a big crater.
Yeah.
You know, not to be too prosaic, but that's just basically the way it is. So in other words, this became a much sought-after item on the black market, on the nuclear black market in the 1990s. Now, the claim was made that this substance was developed by the Soviets in their nuclear program, and that it was actually confected inside of a nuclear reactor. In other words, you had to make this stuff, cook it up, so to speak, inside a nuclear reactor. Then, almost as soon as you heard this story, then immediately scientists around the world said, no, this is all a big hoax, this stuff really doesn't exist, and so on and so forth. The lone exception to that cry was an American scientist by the name of Sam Cohen, who was, in fact, the inventor of the neutron bomb, all right?
Yeah, the size of a tennis ball.
The size of a tennis ball.
Oh,
now,
scary.
a neutron bomb is essentially nothing but a kind of a hydrogen bomb that's used to spit out of a lot of neutrons, all right? But Sam Cohen said he wasn't so sure that this story was as much of a hoax as the other people were saying, because he had been part of projects in the United States in the late 50s to develop precisely a hydrogen bomb that did not need an A-bomb to set it off.
Yeah.
Okay? So, you know, if we can think of it, certainly certainly the Russians can. So,
yes.
You know, so, but the bottom line for me, GeorgeAnn, and this is what I really get to in The Philosopher's Stone, in the book, is, first of all, the color itself, red or maroon in some versions of the red mercury story, is itself an alchemical color. When you sit down and read The Alchemists, they will talk about a sequence of colors that you must observe in a certain order in order to know that you're doing the experiment, that you're doing the work correctly.
Yes.
All right? And the final form of the Philosopher's Stone, in its liquid form, is when it turns either into a brilliant sort of cherry red color or into a kind of deep reddish purple maroon color, all right?
Okay.
Now, we also know something else about what the alchemists were interested in. One of the crucial elements that they were always using in their experiments was, of course, mercury, all right?
Yes.
And mercury, of course, is a liquid metal. It's very, very heavy, and it has certain interesting properties. Now, let's go to the Nazis.
Oh, boy, we can't leave them out.
No, we can't leave them out. If we go to the Nazis and to their Bell project, if you recall, on the inside of the Bell, they put a substance in those two counter-rotating drums.
Yes.
And guess what? It was of a deep maroon color, it was a liquid, and it was really heavy.
Oh.
And they called it IRR Serum 525.
Oh.
All right. So I speculate in The Philosopher's Stone that this Nazi serum is the ultimate basis of the red mercury story, number one. Number two, I speculate that it is kind of an alchemical substance in a peculiar way, in that it is probably compounded out of some isotope of mercury and either thorium or beryllium oxide, which would turn it that reddish color. You know, just think of iron oxide, rust.
Yes.
What color is it? It's kind of a reddish orange.
Yeah.
Any oxide is going to be of a particular kind of color, all right? So I speculate a bit in The Philosopher's Stone that the red mercury story is really probably something that is, in its basic elements, true. But it's not coming from the Soviet Union. It's coming from the Nazi Bell Project. And the Soviets may have, well, in fact, we know they did know about the Bell Project because the man who was executed that gave the affidavit that outlined the Bell Project, an SS general by the name of Jakob Sporenberg, gave all these details in his affidavit, his trial affidavit, about the Bell Project, and one of the things he talks about is this IRR Serum 525. And he was executed in Poland. So we know that the Soviets probably knew about this project, even though they didn't get their hands on it. And Russians being Russians, you know, they're going to back-engineer the project from the document itself, much as I have had to do in my books.
Yes.
So the Red Mercury story, in my opinion, probably has a basis of truth to it, and it's got some connection to this Nazi Bell Project. Now, the interesting thing about the serum, in my reconstruction, is that one of the elements, as I said, that they probably used was thorium oxide. And here we're going to solve a major World War II mystery. Okay? When the Allies went into Nazi Germany, they had a special intelligence mission called the Alsace mission, which was Greek for grove, which was to scour the Third Reich for every atomic secret they could find.
Yeah.
And find out about the real state of the Nazi atom bomb project, all right?
Okay.
Now, the naming of that counterintelligence mission as Alsace, or in other words, Grove, that's kind of a pun on the man that headed up the American Manhattan Project, General Leslie Groves, all right? But one of the curious mysteries that we found when we went into the Third Reich, and it's a mystery that has not been explained to this day, okay?
Okay.
I'm going to explain it.
Oh, boy.
Okay?
All right.
We discovered that the Nazis were stockpiling massive amounts, not just of U-235, but more importantly, they had stockpiled massive amounts of thorium.
Oh.
All right? With me?
Yes.
Now, by the standard nuclear thinking of the day, GeorgeAnn, thorium makes no sense. You can't build a bomb out of it, okay?
Oh.
So, in other words, the Allied engineers are thinking, what in the name of sense are these crazy Nazis stockpiling so much thorium for? You can't use this in a bomb. You see, we had our blinders on.
Yes.
Okay? Well, the Nazis themselves, and this to me is just a gas, because the Nazis told us that they were trying to develop this in a toothpaste as a whitening ingredient. You know?
Are you kidding?
I'm not kidding you. I'm as serious as a clam. Now, GeorgeAnn, stop and think of it the next time you brush your teeth. Would you want to be brushing your teeth with thorium? You know?
I use baking soda, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. But I'll stick to baking soda and hydrogen peroxide.
Yes.
You know, thorium is a bit out of my wallet, you know.
Oh, jeez. Oh my gosh.
But you know, you just have to kind of, you know, bad as the Nazis are, you just kind of have to doff your hat. They're so brazen in telling something so ludicrous.
Well, did we believe it?
Well, of course not. But you know, that's the whole. You know, that's their whole dark inside joke. You know, let these idiot Americans and British try and figure out what we're really doing with this stuff.
Oh,
you know?
That is hilarious.
It really is. Well, okay, so back to thorium. So why are we using thorium in this substance that we're putting inside the bell and pulsing with a lot of electricity? All right? All right, I'm going to tell you. If you recall, well, you may not recall because we haven't discussed this book before. In the last part of The Philosopher's Stone, where I'm talking about the Nazi aspect of all this alchemical stuff,
yeah,
I make the case that one of the technologies that the Nazis were using in their isotope enrichment program was a technology called laser isotope separation.
Okay.
That's right, folks, I said laser, okay? And I make the case there in the book, and we'll probably end up talking about it here in the series. But for now, I'm just asking you to believe that I.G. Farben had a second-generation tunable gas dynamic laser isotope separation technology, and that they were using it to enrich uranium and other exotic isotopes. Now, why would you need that kind of isotope separation technology? After all, centrifuges and cyclotrons and gas diffusion gates, those are good enough to get U-235 to making a bomb. So why are you going to all the expense and effort of coming up with a second-generation technology that's not even discussed in the open literature until about 1979? Oh, gee. Now, I kid you not. It may sound far-fetched and wild, and we can get into later, we can get into why I think the Nazis actually had that kind of technology. But for the moment, assume they did. If you are going to separate exotic isotopes, and in particular a kind of isotope that's called an isomer, then a laser separation technology would be the ticket, all right? Now, it just so happens that thorium has an interesting isomer. An isomer, GeorgeAnn, is an isotope whose atoms, the nuclei of the atoms, are in an extremely high state of spin, an abnormally high state of spin. Okay? So chemically, they behave just like any other atom of the element, but in terms of the nuclear behavior of the element, they behave much differently.
Okay.
All right? Because, again, we're dealing just with the nucleus, and it's whirling around really fast. All right? Thorium has an isomer called Thorium-229 isomer. All right? Now, a laser separation technology is perfect for separating that isomer out from the rest of plain old ordinary thorium that you use in your ordinary household toothpaste.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Toothpaste. Oh my gosh.
I know, it's rich. It's really rich. But anyway, this isomer exists in only a few parts per million. So in other words, if you're going to get enough of this isomer to use for whatever you want to use it for, you have to stockpile a lot of thorium.
Yeah.
And then you have to process it through these laser isotope separation tanks, right? Now, what does an isomer do? Well, Thorium-229 isomer has a very low threshold of stability, which means, that's just the physicist's fancy way of saying, if you get it to slam on the brakes, it'll spit out a lot of energy.
Yeah.
And in the case of a low threshold of stability, it means it doesn't take much to get it to slam on, the brakes. Okay? Now, what happens when an isomer suddenly slams on the brakes and stops it spinning real fast? Well, two things happen, GeorgeAnn. Number one, it spits out gobs. I mean,
of
gobs.
Toothpaste.
Yes, toothpaste. Yeah, we are making this for toothpaste.
That'll put the swizzle in your swizzle stick.
Yes, it'll put the swizzle in your stick, that's right. But no, it spits out gobs of gamma rays. Just gobs and gobs of gamma rays. And of course, gamma rays are much more potent than X-rays, all right?
Yes.
So in other words, you don't want to be around when Thorium-229 isomer is de-exciting, all right?
Yeah.
All right. The second thing that these isomers do, and please listen carefully because we have only discovered this in the open literature in the 1980s. The second thing that isomers will do is without neutron bombardment, they will split. The atom will split.
Oh.
The same thing that happens in an atomic bomb, only the splitting is not caused by smacking a bunch of neutrons into the nucleus, like, billiard balls on a pool table.
Yeah.
It's splitting because all of a sudden you're taking that merry-go-round that's whirling around at 80 miles an hour and slamming on the brakes and bringing it to a dead stop in an instant. And, of course, the merry-go-round will fly apart. So, in other words, the Germans are tinkering around with splitting atoms in a completely different way than anybody else at the time, and that no one else is going to find out about until 30 years later.
Oh, gee.
Oh, gee.
Why am I not surprised?
Why? Yes. Okay, now on top of this, let's remember what they're doing in this Bell device with all of this, goo that they're putting into these cylinders. And remember what the cylinders are doing. They're spinning, aren't they? And they're spinning in counter-rotating directions. And now we're putting a goo inside of each one, spinning it up on the inside of these cylinders. And the goo is made out of an isomer, which is also spinning in a really big, fast state, right?
Yeah.
And then we're going to zap it with gobs of electricity. And, of course, what is this going to do? Well, it's going to turn the mercury into a plasma, and it's going to de-excite the thorium, and the thorium's going to spit out gobs of gamma rays, okay? I mean, are these people a little nuts or what?
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, they're making toothpaste here.
Yeah.
with this machine.
Yes.
But no, what they're doing is they're getting all sorts of energy. They're getting more energy out of the device by this thorium de-exciting than they're putting into the device with the electrical pulsing. That's what they're doing. They're creating a machine that is yielding more energy out of it than they're putting into it. Yeah. And there is your hyperdimensional physics.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
Oh
my gosh. Is it any wonder the Nazi regime classified this project as Kriegsentscheidend, as war decisive? Forget about the atom bomb.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or yeah.
Yeah.
No, so I told you I'd explain what the Germans were doing with this thorium, and it wasn't making toothpaste.
Honestly. Gee.
And, of course, I think what the Russians did is when they, the Russians are just as capable of putting all these dots together as a hack from South Dakota,
Yeah.
So I think what happened is that the Red Mercury story was that simply the Russians, got a hold of this affidavit from this German war criminal describing all this stuff.
Yeah. And
started back engineering what he was describing and made the stuff themselves. That's what I think they did. And who knows? If we're dealing with a mercury-thorium oxide, and the thorium oxide component is made out of thorium-229 isomer, and when that isomer de-excites, it's releasing all this energy, who knows? It may have enough energy to light off a small hydrogen bomb.
Oh, my goodness, Joseph.
Yeah, oh, my goodness is right.
I still can't get over the toothpaste.
Yeah, you can just, GeorgeAnn, you can just picture.
Yes.
These Nazis, with their armbands on, standing in front of these, unshaved British or American soldiers, saying, "Oh, we are making toothpaste here."
Yes.
Or it's as comical as the IG Farben executives in the blocks at Nuremberg telling us that big, huge synthetic rubber plant that they had built at Auschwitz and operated for 4 years and used 25,000 slave laborers to operate during that 4 years produced not 1 ounce of synthetic rubber.
Yeah.
And they sat there and gave that story out straight-faced, and no one has questioned it since as to what is really going on.
Oh, my.
And what's going on is Auschwitz was a key center in the entire Nazi atomic program.
Oh.
That's where they were separating all this isotope.
Oh, my gosh. Oh.
Yeah, oh, my gosh.
Oh, toothpaste.
Toothpaste. Yeah, toothpaste.
Of all things.
Well, I wouldn't put it past IG Farben. I mean, these are the people that gave us fluoridated water.
Yes.
So, who knows? Maybe they were trying to poison everybody with thorium toothpaste.
Oh, gosh. That just...
It's just a stunner, isn't it?
I can just see them standing there straight-faced,
yep,
saying, we're making toothpaste.
Yes. I mean, if it weren't true, it would just be, it's like a badly written opera.
Yeah.
Or something out of the comic strips.
Yeah, exactly. Well, how do crystals play into all this?
How do you mean?
Early on, crystals were used.
Yes.
And how do they play into alchemy?
Well, I don't really get into that aspect in the Philosopher's Stone, but if you look at, I talk about it very briefly, and if you look at, I'm trying to remember which book I talk about it in. I think it's Giza Death Star Destroyed. There is an interesting thing, and again, this comes from Egypt, of the association of certain astrological houses. In other words, Aries or Aquarius or Libra or what have you. You have the association of certain astrological houses in the zodiac with certain stones, with certain crystal stones, all right? And no one, again, I have tried to figure out where this is coming from and why. It is coming from Egypt.
Yeah.
And it is apparently very, very old, because you find similar traditions in the Babylonian version of things. You find this association of stones with the zodiac houses.
Yes.
My guess, and it is purely a guess here, is that this is another legacy of a deep, high, sophisticated physics that pre-existed those civilizations. In other words, once again, they're just handing something down, but they really don't know the significance of. And I don't honestly know the detailed significance either. But my guess is that if you go back to something I said in the Cosmic War series, crystals are natural torsion resonators, all right?
Okay.
In other words, when a crystal grows naturally, it's growing in response to the torsion effects of the Earth's gravitational field, okay? So in other words, you can actually take the torsion tensor in the tensor calculus and use it as a way of describing lattice defects in crystals, okay?
Okay.
Now, that's not a use for it that you're, going to find most physicists ever really talking about, but you can do it that way. I suspect that if all of this alchemical physics of the medium be true, then different types of crystalline chemical structure are going to respond differently to different planetary configurations. In other words, they're going to grow differently. They're going to be more natural resonators of certain configurations than others. Say, I'm trying to think of what some of the correspondences were right off the top of my head. Well, let me just make up a hypothetical. Say the crystalline structure corundum, that's the chemical element that is or chemical compound that's behind sapphire and ruby, all right?
Yes.
And the color is different because variations in the lattice structure and certain types of impurities present, but they're essentially the same compound, all right? Let's say that sapphire, because of the way it is grown in response, as it's grown in response to things, is a more natural resonator to the zodiac sign or the constellation or the configurations of Aquarius.
Yes. Or
certain planetary positions, so on and so forth. In other words, I think what you're dealing with is possibly that this association of crystals with certain signs of the zodiac is really another legacy of this deep physics that someone figured out a long time ago, that certain types of crystals were more natural resonators of certain planetary configurations than others. Now, that's very significant because in my very, very first book in this whole series, the Giza Death Star, right at the end of that book, I think it's in the 8th chapter, I elaborate on an idea of Christopher Dunn's that within the Grand Gallery of the Great Pyramid, you have those 27 slots on either side of the gallery.
Yes.
And that in those slots, he theorizes that they put big, huge banks of Helmholtz resonators. A Helmholtz resonator is just basically a big hollow sphere with kind of a little circle hollowed out on it, so it becomes kind of like a spherical flute or a spherical Coke bottle.
Yeah.
You blow a certain current of air over a Coke bottle and it'll resonate to a certain frequency, and then you fill it with a little water and the frequency will change, and so on and so forth. Well, a Helmholtz resonator does the same thing. They come in different sizes, and the different size makes it resonant to a different frequency. Well, I speculate that rather than Helmholtz resonators, you probably had crystals, because in my reading of it, and Richard Hoagland has come out now with some experimental verification of the idea that pyramidal structures, by their shape and sheer mass, are natural torsion resonators.
Yeah.
Okay? And if that's the case, then these structures are really deliberately designed to resonate to subtle variations and manipulations within the Earth's gravitational field, right? So I theorized that this meant that crystals would have more likely have been what were in those resonator arrays inside the Grand Gallery, because they're not responding to ordinary sound waves. They're responding to gravitational stress waves in the medium, and that's still a kind of a sound wave, but a very, very different kind of sound wave.
Joseph, in an area, in a geographical area that is known to have large, very large deposits of crystal, would there be anomalies there?
Possibly. Depends on what you mean by anomaly, but very possibly. Very possibly. But you would have to have, let's not get too carried away, you would have to have extremely subtle and precise measuring equipment to pick up on some of these things.
Okay.
Okay. When Mr. Hoagland went down to Mesoamerica and did his measurements at Tikal, I think it was, around the pyramids there, he was using an old Bulova Accutron watch, which those were the watches in the early 1960s that had a tiny, tiny little tuning fork in them.
Yes.
To control the accuracy of the timekeeping movement, okay? Because a tuning fork is always going to be vibrating at a certain frequency, right?
Yes.
Now, when he went to Tikal, he took measurements using this finely tuned tuning fork in a Bulova Accutron watch. And depending on where he moved in proximity to the pyramids there, the readings would vary, and he would get wild readings.
Yes.
From this tuning fork. I mean, the inertial properties of the tuning fork changed massively when he was actually sitting on the pyramids themselves.
Yes.
So in other words, again, think of what those things are made out of. They're made out of, in most cases, some silicate form of stone.
Yeah.
And that means that they have within them fine little crystals embedded in them.
Yes.
So again, yeah, I think that you could make a case that you'd find anomalies, but you'd have to know what kind of anomalies you're looking for. You know, Mr. Hoagland did, and he knew then how to construct an experiment that would show it.
Wow, this has been fascinating.
But we're done already?
Oh, Joseph, unless you want to talk about toothpaste.
No, not really. I think the toothpaste connection is probably a dead end.
Oh, that is the wildest thing I've heard in a long time.
Yes, I know. It just really kind of leaves you breathless.
Yes. Yes, it does. Well, how does this play into social engineering?
Well, that's something that we're going to get into down the line, but basically let's go back to what I started with. If you recall what alchemy says, On the one hand, it's telling you something about physics. It's telling you something about the physical medium and about the transmutation of the physical medium. But on the other hand, it's telling you that the alchemist himself has to be prepared for the work. In other words, his consciousness has to be in tune with the physical medium. In other words, there is a direct link. And let me repeat this. This is where all the danger comes from that I have alluded to in previous sessions with you.
Yes.
There is a direct link between consciousness and the physical medium. Direct.
Yes.
You don't go through your local Baptist preacher. You don't go through any sort of religious conversion experience. You don't go through your local priest, rabbi, imam, or what have you. It's direct. Direct.
What you think has great bearing.
What you think has great bearing.
Yeah.
And much more so if a group is thinking it. There's an amplifier effect of groups.
Well,
or, you know, if you want to put it in biblical terms, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, in other words, in a common purpose and common intent.
Yes.
All right?
Yes.
The alchemical side of this, the social engineering side of this, then, is telling you that one and the same techniques are used to engineer a social consciousness. So an alchemical working is not only in the most basic prosaic sense, an alchemical working is not just to confect the philosopher's stone, it's to effect a transmutation of humanity. And there can be good forms of it, obviously, and very, very supremely bad forms of it.
Yes.
And, we've discussed off the air the subject of the book I'm writing about now, and I can tell people because my publisher's already come out with the catalog, and I'm not even done with it yet.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, but the book is called LBJ and the Conspiracy to Kill Kennedy.
Yes.
All right? Now, that book may seem to have absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with alchemy, social engineering, and so on and so forth. Trust me here. If you examine certain aspects of the Kennedy assassination, there are clear fingerprints of esotericism, of the occult, and of alchemy all over it.
Yes, I can attest to that.
Yeah, well, we've discussed it off the air.
Yes.
And I don't really want to discuss, it'll be further on down the line in this series when the book is actually at the printer, and then we can discuss the details. But what I'm saying then is that as one operational goal of the assassination, you had a working that was deliberately designed to engineer a certain state of consciousness within American society.
Yes. That is an awesome statement.
Well, yes, it is.
But it is true.
It is true.
And just like 9/11.
Yes. Yes.
Oh.
Things of this nature, if you know esoteric tradition,
yes,
and look at events like that, the fingerprints are all over those types of events. And you and I have discussed openly before that, at least as far as 9/11, there are clear symbolisms involved with, the collapse of the Twin Towers, because the Twin Towers represent the Masonic pillars, Jachin and Boaz, that you would find in any local Masonic lodge.
Yeah.
And again, you're striking at a symbolic representation of the Anglo-American elite, as well as an actual physical location of that elite.
I don't believe that the Arabs were responsible for that.
Ultimately, no, neither do I. You know who I think is responsible.
Yes.
Because we've discussed that.
Yes.
But, no, I don't either. I think that they were involved, but involved at the least significant level.
Yeah.
I think that there were some involved. But at the deeper levels, I think that there are 3 levels to the whole 9/11 story. There's the level of the official story that we've been told. There is a deeper secondary level that the 9/11 truthers are trying to get people to wake up to.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that even they haven't gone far enough. I think there's an op within an op within an op.
An op, yeah.
Yep.
My goodness.
Yep.
Oh. It never fails to fascinate me how you connect all these things. Joseph, you...
I know certain things.
Oh.
I know certain things. And you and I have discussed that off the air.
Yeah.
I know certain things about how to do it.
Yes.
And those are the dangerous things that I've probably will never tell people.
Yeah.
But they're very real.
You've already had to move once.
Yes.
For your safety.
Yeah. Well, like I say, I just got slammed with something else today. So.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
Mm.
So I do so deeply appreciate those who made donations, and particularly that lady, and you know who you are. And I am truly, truly, truly grateful.
Yes. And with that, the toothpaste hour.
Maybe we should rename the series Toothpaste. Toothpaste and Thorium.
Yes. That is just unbelievable.
Well, you know,
how blatant can you be?
Well, GeorgeAnn, they've been blatant all along. They've sold us this song and dance that, well, Martin Bormann really died here, or maybe it was over there.
Yeah.
And, well, Heinrich Miller, he died here. Well, no, maybe it was over there.
Yeah.
And Hans Kammler, well, he died 4 times. We're not really sure how or when.
It's just amazing.
It's breathtaking. It's the audacity of it is just, when you stop and consider all the strange things that went on at the end of World War II, and really stop and think about them, it's just amazing that people swallow all of the swill and hog wallow that's in history textbooks, because it's just, we have a bunch of Nazis telling us, well, our leader offed himself this way. Now, why in the name of sense, after we've just fought this enormous war, are we going, all of a sudden, are we going to start believing a bunch of Nazis?
Oh, my gosh. It's just breathtaking.
It really is. And the toothpaste, that's just sort of the icing on the cake.
It really is. I mean, to stand there and straight-faced, yes. I can just picture this.
Well, I can too. And you've got to put yourself in the position of these allied scientists. They obviously they're not going to be buying the toothpaste story, but on the other hand, they haven't a clue as to what in the name of sense are these stupid Nazis doing with all of this thorium.
Oh my gosh! Oh, well, Joseph, thank you. And
you're welcome. Thank you for having me back.
And God bless you.
You too.
Thank you, Joseph. Everybody, please go to GizaDeathStar.com. Make a donation. It's very urgent. Please.
And please don't forget, GeorgeAnn. We got to keep her shows going too.
Oh, yes.
It's not, you know, I've been investigating, GeorgeAnn, I haven't told you this, I've been investigating doing an internet show myself, and the costs, and I just, I'm really kind of flabbergasted.
Yes.
Doing the type of show you do. I'm really flabbergasted.
Oh. Well, we will continue this series, The Philosopher's Stone and the Magic of Social Engineering. And boy, Joseph, this is fascinating stuff.
Yes, it is. It is it's endlessly fascinating, and it's another aspect of the story that needs to be done, and needs to be done carefully. I hope I am. There's been a lot of research in the field by a lot of researchers far more capable than I, but we'll see where it goes.
Okay. Well, God bless everybody out there.
Amen.
Yes, and thanks for listening. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes with Dr. Joseph P. Farrell signing off. Good night, everybody. Toothpaste. Oh, gee.
The Byte Show is listener supported at thebyteshow.com.